Hey guys, tonight we begin with religious leaders whose behavior was so scandalous that the fines, punishments, and reforms that followed literally changed where people slept, how they organized their households, what times they woke and worked, and how they understood their relationship to divine authority. The papal scandals of the medieval and Renaissance periods weren't just moral failures by individual popes. They were systemic crises that triggered financial penalties, institutional reforms, and social reorganizations that rippled through European society for generations. When a pope fathers children, murders rivals, sells church offices, or hosts orgies in the Vatican, the consequences extend far beyond his personal damnation. They reshape how the entire church operates and how ordinary Christians live their daily lives. Here's why these historical scandals matter beyond salacious biography. The response to papal corruption created many of the institutional structures and social practices that defined late medieval and early modern Europe. The fines levied against corrupt clergy funded everything from cathedral construction to university endowments. The reforms enacted to prevent future scandals changed how priests lived, where they slept, who could visit them, and what supervision they endured. The loss of papal moral authority enabled secular rulers to assert control over religious institutions in their territories, fundamentally altering the balance between church and state. Understanding papal scandals means understanding how moral failures by elites trigger institutional transformations that affect populations who had nothing to do with the original corruption. The transformation these crises created was comprehensive. Before major scandals and reforms, priests often lived in their own homes with women they called housekeepers, but who functioned as wives, producing children who were open secrets in their communities. After reforms, priests were increasingly forced into communal ecclesiastical housing under supervision, their private lives monitored, their households stripped of female presence except for elderly relatives past childbearing age. Monasteries and convents that had operated with lax discipline and porous boundaries between religious and secular life were reformed into strict enclosed institutions where contact with the outside world was minimal and regimented. The daily rhythms of religious life, the architecture of ecclesiastical buildings, and the social relationships between clergy and laity all changed in response to scandals at the top of the church hierarchy. Tonight, we're examining the most notorious papal scandals from the 10th through 16th centuries. The financial and institutional consequences that followed each crisis, how these consequences changed the physical and social organization of religious life, and what this reveals about how institutional corruption gets addressed through reforms that affect people far removed from the original wrongdoing. We'll see how one pope's illegitimate children triggered architecture changes in bishops' residences across Europe, how another's financial corruption funded university systems that lasted centuries, and how the cumulative effect of multiple scandals enabled the Protestant Reformation that split Christianity permanently. If examining how elite corruption shapes institutional and daily life appeals to you, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Candle History, but only if you're interested in historical analysis that connects personal scandals to systemic transformations. Drop a comment sharing whether you think institutions can ever fully prevent corruption by individuals in power, or whether scandal and reform is just an endless cycle. The question matters for every institution we build. Now settle in and let's explore how popes behaving badly changed how everyone else had to live. The period historians call the pornocracy, or the rule of harlots, dominated Rome from roughly 904 to 964, when powerful Roman aristocratic families controlled papal selection through a combination of violence, bribery, and strategic relationships between noble women and popes they installed. The name itself reveals the scandal. Pornocracy, from the Greek for rule by prostitutes, though these weren't streetwalkers, but rather noble women like Theodora and her daughter Marozia, who wielded political power partly through relationships with church leaders. These women and their families treated the papacy as political office to be captured and controlled for factional advantage within Roman politics, selecting popes based on family loyalty rather than religious qualifications. Marozia exemplified the system's dysfunction. She was allegedly the mistress of Pope Sergius III, who may have fathered her son. When that son came of age, she arranged for him to become Pope John XI in 931, while she was around 45 years old, creating a situation where a woman ruled Rome through her Pope's son, who owed his position to her machinations. John XI's papacy lasted 4 years, during which Marozia and her current husband Alberic dominated Roman politics, with the Pope serving essentially as puppet to his mother's ambitions. The arrangement collapsed only when Alberic rebelled against his mother and imprisoned both her and Pope John XI, with Alberic then controlling papal selection himself until his death in 954. Pope John XII, who became pope in 955 at around 18 years old, brought the pornocracy to its scandalous peak. Contemporary accounts describe him hosting gambling parties in the Lateran Palace, turning parts of the Vatican into what one historian called a brothel, and allegedly having relations with married women and his father's mistress. The charges against him at the synod called by Emperor Otto I in 963 included committing adultery with various named women, blinding his confessor, castrating and murdering a cardinal, and toasting to the devil during drinking sessions. Whether all these charges were accurate or whether some were political fabrications by enemies, the fact that they were plausible enough to be officially documented demonstrates how far papal conduct had declined. The pornocracy era created first major wave of institutional reforms aimed at preventing such corruption in the future. The Holy Roman emperors asserted rights to confirm papal elections, arguing that secular authority needed oversight power to prevent factional manipulation of the papacy. The Lateran Synod of 1059 established the College of Cardinals as the exclusive electors of popes, removing the decision from Roman mob politics and noble family control. These reforms changed where popes lived and how they were selected, creating institutional buffers between Roman aristocratic power and papal selection that, while imperfect, did end the most blatant family domination of the office. The financial consequences included confiscation of properties belonging to the Roman families who had controlled the papacy, redistribution of church offices away from factional appointees, and reorganization of revenue streams to reduce dependency on Roman aristocratic support. These financial reforms funded the strengthening of papal administrative capacity and the construction of fortifications that would protect future popes from mob violence. The scandal's resolution required spending money to build institutional independence, with those expenditures shaping how the medieval papacy operated for the next several centuries. The corrupt families paid some direct fines, but more importantly, they lost the revenue streams and political influence that controlling the papacy had provided. The investiture controversy of the 11th and 12th centuries emerged partly from recognition that the pornocracy era's problems stemmed from insufficient separation between secular political power and ecclesiastical office. When secular rulers controlled who became bishops and abbots, they appointed loyal political supporters rather than qualified religious leaders, creating clergy who were essentially secular officials with religious titles. The reformers, particularly Pope Gregory VII, insisted that only church authorities should appoint church officials, that secular rulers had no legitimate role in selecting bishops, even though those bishops controlled substantial lands and populations within secular kingdoms. The resulting struggle between papal and imperial authority lasted decades and transformed both institutions. The financial dimensions were enormous. Bishops controlled vast estates, collected tithes and fees from populations in their dioceses, and wielded political power equal to secular nobles. When kings appointed bishops, they effectively controlled this wealth and power. When popes gained appointment authority, they controlled it instead. The struggle was about money and power, disguised as theological principle. Both sides claimed divine authority for their positions, while pursuing thoroughly material interests in controlling appointments that came with revenues and armies. The fines and confiscations that occurred during the controversy involved some of the wealthiest estates in Europe changing hands as different factions gained temporary advantage. The Concordat of Worms in 1122 created compromise, where the Church officially appointed bishops, but secular rulers could be present at elections and could invest bishops with temporal powers and properties after church consecration. This separation of spiritual investiture, church authority, from temporal investiture, secular authority, created complicated dual authority systems that required extensive legal frameworks to manage. The administrative costs of maintaining these systems were substantial, requiring both church and secular governments to develop more sophisticated bureaucracies capable of negotiating the boundaries between their jurisdictions. The solution to scandal was institutional complexity that cost money but reduced direct conflict. The lifestyle reforms that accompanied the investiture struggle targeted clerical marriage and concubinage, which reformers identified as sources of corruption because married clergy treated church offices as family property they could pass to their children. The Lateran councils of 1123 and 1139 prohibited clerical marriage and declared existing clerical marriages invalid. Priests who had been living as married men with families were forced to send their wives and children away or surrender their positions. The human cost was substantial. Women who had functioned as priests' wives for decades suddenly lost their status and support, while children of priests lost their inheritance expectations and social standing. The reforms solved institutional problems by destroying family structures that had existed for generations. The architectural and domestic consequences included construction of separate clergy housing that could be supervised by bishops, redesign of rectories and church residences to eliminate private family spaces, and establishment of chapter houses where clergy lived communally under rules prohibiting private entertaining or female visitors. The physical layout of ecclesiastical life changed to embody the reforms, with buildings designed to prevent the relationships that reformers wanted to eliminate. The costs of this construction were passed to parishes and dioceses through various fees and fines on clergy who violated the new rules. Those who continued living with women faced escalating penalties that funded the institutional transformation meant to prevent exactly such relationships. The Western Schism from 1378 to 1417 created a situation where 2 and eventually 3 men simultaneously claimed to be legitimate pope, each controlling different territories and collecting revenues from Christians who recognized their authority. The split began when Urban VI's election was disputed, with dissatisfied cardinals claiming duress invalidated the election and choosing Clement VII as rival pope. Urban remained in Rome, while Clement established himself in Avignon, creating parallel papal administrations that both needed funding. European kingdoms chose which pope to recognize based on political alliances rather than theological conviction, splitting the revenue base that normally supported a single papal administration. The financial mechanics were devastating for the Church. Each pope had full administrative apparatus, including cardinals, bishops, and bureaucrats who all needed salaries. Each wanted to maintain a papal court appropriate to the office's dignity. Each faced the problem that their revenue base was roughly half what a universally recognized pope would enjoy. The competition drove both sides to more aggressive revenue extraction from their territories, with increased fees for church appointments, more frequent special taxes on clergy, and more systematic sale of indulgences and pardons. The financial pressure from having multiple papal administrations pushed the Church toward more systematic monetization of spiritual services, practices that would eventually spark the Protestant Reformation. The fines and penalties during the schism functioned differently because each pope claimed exclusive authority, while the others were anti-popes. When Urban VI excommunicated Clement VII's supporters, those excommunications theoretically carried penalties including property confiscation. But enforcement depended on whether local secular authorities recognized Urban's legitimacy. Some individuals and institutions were fined by both sides simultaneously, creating impossible situations where complying with one pope meant violating the other's commands and incurring his penalties. The legal chaos enriched lawyers who specialized in navigating the contradictory requirements, but damaged church credibility with laypeople who saw the cynical political and financial motivations behind the theological rhetoric. The Council of Constance that ended the schism in 1417 had to address massive financial cleanup problems. Properties had changed hands based on now questionable authority. Church offices had been sold by popes whose legitimacy was retroactively denied. Fines had been paid to the wrong administration. The council had to decide which transactions would be honored and which would be unwound, a process that took years and required extensive documentation review. The compromise approach of recognizing most transactions while denying legitimacy to some of the most egregious sales created complex legal situations that provided employment for canon lawyers for generations. The scandal's resolution generated institutional complexity that became a permanent feature of church administration. The daily life effects were profound for clergy caught between competing authorities. Some priests served parishes where their bishop recognized Rome, while the local lord recognized Avignon, creating conflicts about which prayers to use, which holy days to observe, and which authority to obey on matters of discipline. Some clergy were ordained by one obedience and then moved to territories controlled by the other, creating questions about whether their ordinations were valid and whether their sacraments were effective. The uncertainty affected ordinary Christians who didn't know whether their confessions were heard by legitimate priests or whether their marriages were valid. The schism demonstrated how elite disputes about power and money ultimately disrupted the daily religious practices and domestic security of millions who had no voice in the dispute. Pope Alexander VI, who reigned from 1492 to 1503, exemplified Renaissance papal corruption at its most theatrical and shameless. Rodrigo Borgia bought his election through extensive bribes to cardinals, openly acknowledged his illegitimate children, appointed his teenage son Cesare as cardinal, threw lavish parties that contemporary accounts describe as orgies, and used papal authority to advance his family's political and territorial ambitions throughout Italy. The banquet of chestnuts, allegedly held in the papal apartments in 1501, where prostitutes supposedly competed to pick up chestnuts scattered on the floor while naked, may have been propaganda invented by Borgia enemies, but the fact that people believed such stories indicates how thoroughly Alexander VI had destroyed papal moral authority. The financial corruption was systematic rather than opportunistic. Alexander VI sold church offices so consistently that contemporaries understood getting appointed to lucrative positions required substantial payments to the Pope or his associates. He created new cardinal positions specifically to sell them, expanding the College of Cardinals to generate revenue from men who wanted the prestige and income of cardinal status. He awarded contracts and monopolies to family allies in exchange for shares of profits. He diverted church revenues meant for crusades against the Ottoman Empire to instead fund his son Cesare's military campaigns in central Italy. The Vatican under Alexander VI functioned as family business, using institutional resources for private enrichment. The marriage alliances Alexander VI arranged for his children demonstrated how thoroughly he treated the papacy as secular dynasty. He married his daughter Lucrezia to Giovanni Sforza for political alliance, then arranged an annulment when that alliance became inconvenient, and married her to Alfonso of Aragon for different political advantages. When Alfonso was killed in circumstances suggesting Borgia family involvement, Alexander married Lucrezia a third time to Alfonso d'Este to secure different alliance. Each marriage involved dowries drawn from church funds and political considerations that subordinated ecclesiastical interests to Borgia family ambitions. The message to European observers was clear. The Pope treated church resources as family property. The immediate financial consequences were limited because Alexander VI died before significant reforms could be imposed, and because the scandal was so comprehensive that no single reform package could address all dimensions of the corruption. His successor, Julius II, was also ambitious and politically engaged, but was more circumspect about personal behavior and patronage. The longer-term consequences included increasing criticism of papal financial practices from humanist scholars and religious reformers who used Alexander VI as example of what happened when church leadership abandoned spiritual mission for material pursuits. The Borgia papacy became standard reference point for reform advocates arguing that the church needed fundamental restructuring to prevent such comprehensive corruption. The fines that eventually followed weren't direct punishment of Alexander VI, but rather extraction from his family after his death. Caesar Borgia lost his titles and properties when Julius II took power. Lucretia Borgia kept her position as Duchess of Ferrara through her third marriage, but lost political influence. The broader Borgia family network that Alexander VI had enriched through church resources faced systematic dismantling of their power base. Properties they'd acquired through questionable means were reclaimed by the church. Offices they held were reassigned. The financial unwinding of Borgia patronage networks took years and redistributed substantial wealth and political power. The scandal's cost was paid not by Alexander VI, but by his descendants and allies who lost the positions and properties he'd illegitimately secured for them. The scandal-driven reforms transformed where clergy slept in ways that fundamentally changed their daily lives and relationships with communities. Before reforms, parish priests often lived in their own homes that were indistinguishable from other houses in the village or town. They had private quarters, family spaces, and domestic arrangements similar to any married layman. The reforms, driven by concerns about clerical concubinage and inappropriate relationships, required clergy to live in church-owned housing attached to the church building itself or in quarters where their behavior could be monitored by ecclesiastical authorities. The transition from private home to institutional residence was traumatic for many priests who had to abandon houses they'd lived in for decades. The architectural changes were substantial. Churches that previously had no priest residence needed to construct rectories or expand existing buildings to include living quarters. These new structures were designed specifically to facilitate supervision and prevent impropriety. They typically included public rooms where the priest could meet parishioners, but minimal private space. Bedrooms were small and austere rather than comfortable. Kitchens were sized for single occupants rather than families. The design communicated that the priest's residence was workplace rather than home, that his domestic life was subordinate to his ecclesiastical function, and that he should expect minimal privacy. The construction costs was significant, typically paid through fees assessed on parishes or through fines on priests who violated behavior codes. The prohibition on female housekeepers, except for elderly relatives past childbearing age, created practical domestic problems. Priests who had relied on women to manage their households, cook their meals, clean their residences, and handle laundry suddenly needed alternative arrangements. Some hired elderly women who qualified under the restrictions. Others relied on male servants or altar boys for domestic work. Some simply lived in relative squalor because they couldn't or wouldn't manage household tasks themselves. The reforms assumed male clergy could live independently without female assistance, an assumption that proved optimistic in many cases. The result was either poorly maintained residences or expensive male servant arrangements that strained modest priestly incomes. The communal living arrangements that some reforms imposed were even more restrictive. In areas where bishops enforced reform strictly, priests might be required to live in groups in shared residences where they could monitor each other. These arrangements mimicked monastic community life, but applied to secular clergy who weren't monks and hadn't chosen communal living. The shared sleeping quarters, common meals, and collective schedules eliminated privacy and subjected priests to constant peer surveillance. Some adapted well to this monastic style life. Others chafed under restrictions they hadn't anticipated when accepting ordination. The enforcement varied by diocese, depending on individual bishops' priorities and resources, creating geographic variation in how strictly reforms were implemented. The exceptions and workarounds demonstrated the gap between reform ambitions and implementation reality. Wealthy priests could sometimes afford arrangements that technically complied with regulations while providing more comfort and privacy than rules intended. Priests with family wealth might arrange for family members to serve as housekeepers within the permitted categories. Priests in remote areas with limited episcopal oversight sometimes continued old patterns despite official prohibitions. The reforms succeeded in changing norms about what was publicly acceptable, but couldn't completely eliminate private arrangements that violated those norms. The result was performative compliance, where priests maintained appearances that satisfied authorities, while their actual living situations were more complicated than official rules allowed. The reforms targeting monasteries and convents in response to scandals about lax discipline and irregular behavior intensified enclosure requirements that strictly limited contact between religious communities and the outside world. Before reforms, many monasteries operated with relatively porous boundaries, where monks could leave grounds regularly, outsiders could visit readily, and the distinction between monastic and secular life was blurry. The scandals that drove reform included cases of monks fathering children with servants or local women, nuns having affairs with priests or laymen, and religious communities engaging in commerce and property management indistinguishable from secular business. The reform response was to impose strict enclosure that physically separated religious from secular life. The architectural transformations included building walls around monastery grounds with controlled gates that could be locked and monitored. Convents received particularly strict requirements, with rules prohibiting nuns from leaving under almost any circumstances and severely limiting who could enter. The parlors where nuns could speak with visitors were redesigned with grills or screens, preventing physical contact. The number of gates was reduced to a single entrance that could be supervised constantly. These physical barriers embodied theological conviction that religious life required separation from worldly temptation. They also demonstrated lack of trust in religious communities to maintain discipline without physical barriers preventing contact with temptation. The sleep-in arrangements within enclosed monasteries became more regimented. Dormitories replaced private cells in many communities, with monks or nuns sleeping in large rooms where privacy was minimal and behavior could be observed. The elimination of private sleeping quarters was meant to prevent secret relationships or individual lapses from discipline. Some communities resisted these changes, arguing that mature adults in religious life deserved private space, and that dormitory sleeping was appropriate only for novices or young religious. The disputes about sleeping arrangements revealed tensions between reform impulses toward total supervision and traditional views that professed religious deserved trust and privacy appropriate to their vows. The daily schedule reforms that accompanied physical enclosure created rhythms of life quite different from earlier, more flexible monastic practice. The Reformed communities emphasized strict adherence to hourly offices, communal meals with no exceptions, and minimal unstructured time when monks or nuns might be alone. The schedules left little opportunity for private deviation from community norms, because every hour was accounted for in collective activities. This was monastic life as total institution, anticipating Foucault's later analysis of how organizations control members through complete scheduling. The reforms succeeded in creating more disciplined communities, but at cost of making monastic life more regimented and less appealing to potential recruits who valued some personal autonomy. The enforcement problems were substantial because enclosure reforms required resources many monasteries lacked. Building walls was expensive. Maintaining constant gate supervision required personnel. Enforcing strict schedules demanded vigilance. Poorer monasteries couldn't afford the physical infrastructure reforms required. Remote monasteries lacked sufficient personnel to maintain supervision demanded by reforms. The result was uneven implementation, where wealthy urban monasteries complied, while poor rural communities maintained older, looser patterns. The geographic and economic variation meant that enclosure reforms solved scandal problems in some locations while leaving them unaddressed in others. The reforms demonstrated how institutional solutions to corruption require resources that aren't equally available across organizations nominally subject to the same rules. The sale of indulgences reached systematic commercialization in the 15th and 16th centuries, as popes used indulgence revenue to fund major projects, including St. Peter's Basilica reconstruction. Indulgences were supposed to reduce temporal punishment for sin through grant of spiritual merit, but the sales process made them function like financial products, where purchasing an indulgence bought specific amount of punishment reduction, measured in days or years off purgatory. The system allowed lay people to support church projects while receiving spiritual benefits, creating what the church presented as mutually beneficial exchange. Critics saw it as simony, the sale of spiritual goods for material profit, and as particularly exploitative when marketed to poor people desperate to reduce their deceased relatives' purgatorial suffering. Johann Tetzel's indulgence sales campaign in Germany in 1517 exemplified the system's most aggressive and ethically questionable practices. Tetzel was raising money for St. Peter's reconstruction, while half the proceeds secretly went to Archbishop Albrecht of Mainz to repay debts he'd incurred buying his church office. The arrangement meant that poor German Christians were paying to fund both papal construction and a corrupt bishop's debts through purchases Tetzel marketed as benefiting their suffering relatives in purgatory. Tetzel's reported sales pitch included rhymes like, "When a coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs," reducing complex theology about sin, repentance, and divine mercy to commercial jingles promising immediate spiritual results for payment. The cynicism was breathtaking. Martin Luther's 95 Theses, posted in response to Tetzel's campaign, weren't initially revolutionary challenge to papal authority, but rather theological objections to specific indulgence practices within framework of accepting papal authority generally. Luther argued that indulgences couldn't remit guilt or punishment decreed by God, only punishments imposed by church authorities, and its selling them as though they could purchase divine forgiveness was fraud. He questioned whether the Pope knew about and approved the most aggressive indulgence sales tactics, or whether subordinates were operating beyond their authority in ways that damaged both lay faithful and church credibility. The implications were explosive, even though Luther's initial stance was relatively moderate. The financial aftermath of the indulgence controversy included dramatic reduction in indulgence purchases as Luther's arguments gained traction, and as Protestant areas eliminated the practice entirely. The revenue loss was substantial for both the papacy and the German bishops who'd relied on indulgence income. The church had to find alternative funding sources for projects like St. Peter's construction, slowing some work and requiring prioritization of which projects would continue. The financial pressure created incentives to compromise with reformers where possible and to suppress reform movement where compromise failed. The choice between losing revenue and losing doctrinal authority created impossible dilemmas for church leadership. The lifestyle effects for ordinary Christians included both financial relief and spiritual anxiety. Those who had been spending scarce resources on indulgences could now spend that money on family needs, or could donate it to reformed churches that promised more authentic spiritual guidance. But many also felt anxiety about whether their deceased relatives would suffer longer in purgatory without indulgences to shorten their punishment. The Reformed alternative of salvation through faith alone, without purgatory, eliminated the problem theologically, but required accepting Luther's claims that centuries of church teaching about purgatory were wrong. The choice between continuing expensive indulgence purchases and accepting Protestant theology that denied their efficacy created household religious and financial tensions that divided families and communities. The Council of Trent from 1545 to 1563 represented the Catholic Church's comprehensive response to both Protestant criticism and internal recognition that reform was necessary to address real corruption and restore credibility. The council addressed doctrine, church governance, clerical education and behavior, liturgical practice, and financial administration across multiple sessions spread over 18 years. The reforms it mandated transformed how Catholicism functioned globally, creating the Counter-Reformation Church that would operate until the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s. The breadth and depth of Trent's reforms acknowledged that the crisis was systemic rather than isolated to individual corrupt officials. The requirements for seminary education represented one of Trent's most consequential reforms. Before Trent, most priests had minimal formal training, learning their role through apprenticeship with existing clergy who might themselves be poorly educated. Trent mandated that every diocese establish a seminary for systematic clerical education covering theology, scripture, canon law, liturgy, and moral theology. The educational reform addressed criticism that priests didn't understand the doctrines they were supposed to teach, and that lack of education contributed to corruption and simony. The seminary system required substantial investment in buildings, faculty, and curricula, with costs borne by dioceses through various fees and assessments. The reform improved clerical quality, but decades passed before most dioceses actually established functioning seminaries. The residency requirements for bishops addressed scandal, where bishops held multiple bishoprics simultaneously, collecting revenues from each, but rarely or never residing in their dioceses or performing their pastoral duties. Trent required bishops to actually live in their dioceses, to visit parishes regularly, to supervise clergy personally, and to hold diocesan synods periodically. These requirements meant bishops who had been absentees, living in Rome or at royal courts while drawing salaries, had to choose between their comfortable lives and their church offices. Many resisted the requirement through various workarounds, but the general enforcement was sufficient to reduce the most egregious absenteeism. The reform made being a bishop less lucrative and more demanding, reducing some incentive for simony in acquiring bishop positions. The financial reforms attempted to reduce simony and the perception that church offices were for sale. Trent prohibited selling church offices, benefices, or sacraments, though enforcement was uneven and the prohibition couldn't fully eliminate practices so deeply embedded in church finance. The reforms also addressed indulgences, not eliminating them, but removing the most abusive practices, including monetary transactions directly connected to indulgence grants. Indulgences could still be earned through prayer, pilgrimage, or acts of charity, but the direct payment for indulgence model that had financed major projects was curtailed. This reform reduced revenue while attempting to restore spiritual credibility, a trade-off the Church accepted as necessary for survival in Protestant competition. The standardization of liturgy through the Roman Missal and Breviary, eliminated local variations in Catholic practice, creating uniformity that made Catholic worship recognizable globally. The liturgical standardization served multiple purposes. It created clear standards against which Protestant deviations could be identified. It simplified clerical training by reducing the variety of practices priests needed to learn, and it strengthened papal authority by making Rome the source of legitimate liturgical practice. The implementation required distributing printed liturgical books throughout Catholic territories, training clergy in the standardized rites, and suppressing local traditions that had existed for centuries. The costs included both the material expense of books and the cultural loss of regional variations that had made liturgy responsive to local contexts. The post-Trent reforms reorganized Catholic households in ways that shaped daily life, family structure, and religious practice for generations. The emphasis on regular confession and communion, the standardization of catechetical instruction for children, and the increased emphasis on sacramental marriage properly witnessed by clergy all created new routines and requirements for Catholic families. These weren't just religious practices. They were mechanisms of social control that structured how families organized their time, how they understood family relationships, and how they interacted with church authority. The household became a site of religious discipline in ways it hadn't been when Catholic practice was less regulated and less uniformly enforced. The confessional requirements particularly shaped family life because confessors could inquire about household relationships, parenting practices, employment ethics, and interpersonal behavior in ways that brought church oversight into domestic sphere. The confessional became a disciplinary mechanism where priests learned about and could correct behaviors ranging from domestic violence to birth control practice to dishonest business dealings. This oversight varied by individual priests' diligence and interpretation of confessional role, but the structural potential for household surveillance through confession created new power dynamic between clergy and laity. Families knew their priest might learn their private affairs through confession, creating incentives to maintain appearances and to conform to church teaching in ways that minimized confessional complications. The catechism instruction for children formalized religious education that had previously been informal and inconsistent. Trent mandated that priests teach children the essential prayers, the creed, the commandments, and basic Catholic doctrine in regular classes. This requirement created new time demands on both priests and families. Children needed to attend catechism sessions regularly, requiring parents to ensure their presence and to reinforce lessons at home. The formalized religious education created clear standards for what Catholic children should know, making it easier to identify and correct deviations from orthodoxy. It also created generational transmission mechanism, ensuring that Trent's reforms would be internalized by Catholics who grew up after the Council, even if their parents maintained some pre-Trent practices. The marriage reforms required that Catholic marriages be performed publicly by clergy with witnesses present, ending the informal, clandestine marriages that had been common in some regions. This requirement gave the Church gatekeeping power over marriage formation and created documentation that established who was married to whom, preventing bigamy and clarifying inheritance rights. The reform solved practical problems, but also increased church oversight of family formation. Couples who wanted to marry now needed priestly cooperation, giving clergy leverage over their behavior. Couples who were cohabiting without formal marriage faced pressure to regularize their unions through church ceremony. The requirement created new fees for marriage ceremonies that generated revenue, while also serving church interest in controlling family formation. The Sunday and feast day obligations required Catholics to attend Mass, creating weekly and seasonal rhythms that structured time and required coordination between work schedules and religious calendars. The enforcement varied, but the expectation was clear. Catholics should attend Mass unless prevented by serious circumstances, and failure to attend was sin, requiring confession. This created weekly anchoring of time, where Sunday became distinct from weekdays, where work was prohibited or at least discouraged, and where the church building became social gathering place, where community could be observed and monitored. The effect was to make Catholic identity more visible and more publicly performed, reducing space for private conscience or individual interpretation of religious obligation. The reformed monastic schedules, mandated by Trent and enforced with varying success across Catholic orders, created sleep patterns quite different from both secular life and from pre-reformed monastic practice. The emphasis on the full cycle of daily offices, including matins, traditionally observed around 2 a.m., meant that monks and nuns operating under strict schedules had interrupted sleep rather than continuous nighttime rest. They would sleep for several hours after Compline, wake for matins, possibly sleep again until lauds at dawn, or remain awake for early morning prayers. This bimodal sleep pattern was common in pre-industrial societies, but the monastic version was particularly regimented and religiously mandated rather than naturally adopted. The enforcement of the office schedule varied dramatically by order and by individual monastery. The strictest observance came from reform movements like the Discalced Carmelites established by Teresa of Avila, whose convents maintained rigorous schedules, including middle-of-night prayers regardless of weather, illness, or fatigue. Other communities were more flexible, allowing elderly or sick members to skip night offices, or interpreting the requirement more laxly when practical circumstances made strict observance difficult. The variation meant that monastic life differed substantially depending on which order someone joined and which specific house they entered. The reputation for strict versus relaxed observance influenced recruitment, with strict houses attracting more devout candidates, while relaxed houses drew those who wanted religious life without extreme asceticism. The health effects of interrupted sleep were poorly understood in the early modern period, but were probably significant. Some religious experienced chronic fatigue from the demand in schedule. Others adapted well to the rhythm. The variation was individual and wasn't systematically studied at the time, though monastic rules acknowledged that the schedule wasn't sustainable for everyone by including provisions for elderly or infirm members. The fact that rules included these exemptions suggests awareness that the schedule was demanding, even if the health mechanisms weren't understood. Modern sleep research would characterize these monastic schedules as severe chronic sleep fragmentation, with likely cognitive and health costs. Though many early modern religious probably experienced less disruption than we might assume, because they were adapted to pre-industrial sleep patterns that already included nighttime waking. The contrast with secular sleep patterns after Trent was significant. While monasteries maintained interrupted nocturnal schedules, Reformed Catholic lay practice didn't require nighttime religious observance. Laity were expected to attend morning mass on Sundays and feast days, but could organize their sleep around this requirement. The distinction marked one boundary between religious and secular life, where accepting religious vows meant accepting sleep patterns that demonstrated commitment through their physical difficulty. The symbolism was clear. Religious life required sacrifices that secular life didn't, including the basic comfort of uninterrupted nighttime sleep. This made religious life seem more distinct and more demanding than when monastic and secular sleep patterns were more similar. This made religious life seem more distinct and more demanding than when monastic and secular sleep patterns were more similar. The enforcement mechanisms for sleep schedules within monasteries included having the superior or designated members ring bells or personally wake those who might oversleep. The community nature of the observance meant that individual lapses were visible to others, creating peer pressure to maintain the schedule. The physical arrangement with dormitories or cells in proximity meant that failing to rise for offices was noticeable. This surveillance system was partly about maintaining discipline and partly about practical necessity, because the liturgy required multiple participants. The enforcement demonstrated how the Reformed monasteries functioned as total institutions, where even sleep was subject to institutional control, and where privacy was subordinate to community discipline. The fines, confiscations, and financial reforms following papal scandals redistributed substantial wealth within the church and between church and secular authorities. Properties that corrupt popes had granted to family members were often reclaimed after their deaths. Church offices that had been sold were sometimes reassigned with the original payment forfeit. Territories that papal families had conquered using church resources were sometimes returned to prior rulers or integrated into papal states proper. The scale of redistribution was enormous because Renaissance popes had been treating church assets as family property for generations. Unwinding their appropriations required complex legal processes and political negotiations that occupied church administrators for decades. The beneficiaries of redistribution included both Reformed church institutions and secular rulers who extracted concessions during the weakened papal authority following major scandals. Universities received endowments from properties reclaimed from corrupt officials. Hospitals and charitable institutions got funding from fines and confiscations. At the same time, kings and princes negotiated increased control over church appointments and revenues within their territories by threatening to join the Protestant reform or by exploiting papal weakness to gain concessions. The redistribution wasn't just internal church housecleaning. It was a fundamental shift in the balance of wealth and power between ecclesiastical and secular authorities.
The taxation of clergy to fund reforms created new revenue streams that shaped church operations for centuries. Trent's mandates for seminaries, residency requirements, and administrative improvements required funding beyond what normal tithes and fees generated. The solution was levying taxes on clergy proportional to their benefices' income. Wealthier bishops and abbots paid substantial sums that funded institutional infrastructure. The clerical taxation was controversial because it reduced clerical income while being justified as necessary for institutional improvement. The resistance was significant, but ultimately unsuccessful because the reform's legitimacy was hard to challenge after the scandals that had made them necessary. The clergy paid for the institutional transformation prompted by the corruption of their leadership. The long-term financial effects included shift from seeing church resources as available for personal enrichment by officials to seeing them as institutional property requiring fiduciary management. This didn't eliminate corruption, but it changed its nature and frequency. Post-Trent church officials had to be more circumspect about personal appropriation because institutional accountability mechanisms had improved. The financial reforms created bureaucratic procedures for authorizing expenditures, reviewing accounts, and auditing transactions. The bureaucratization increased administrative costs, but reduced the scope for individual officials to treat church resources as personal assets. The trade-off between administrative efficiency and corruption resistance tilted toward corruption resistance after the scandals made efficiency less important than accountability. The modern parallel is how major corporate or nonprofit scandals trigger compliance reforms that increase administrative burden but reduce opportunities for fraud. The Church's post-scandal bureaucratization anticipated Sarbanes-Oxley-style reforms that increase costs but hopefully prevent future scandals. The question then and now is whether the administrative overhead is worth the corruption prevention, whether the mechanisms actually prevent corruption or just make it more complicated, and whether the culture change accompanying rule changes is more important than the rules themselves.
The medieval church learned that rules without enforcement are meaningless, but also that enforcement is expensive and never completely successful. The lessons remain relevant for any institution dealing with scandal and attempting reform. The Protestant Reformation fundamentally altered the competitive environment for Catholicism by creating alternative Christian denominations that criticized Catholic corruption and offered different models of church organization. The Catholic response had to address both the theological challenges and the practical competition for members and resources. The Counter-Reformation wasn't just defensive reaction. It was a comprehensive effort to make Catholicism competitive with Protestantism by eliminating the most scandalous abuses while maintaining distinctive Catholic doctrines and practices that Protestants rejected. The balance between reform and tradition was delicate because changing too much might suggest Protestants were right about Catholic corruption, while changing too little would allow Protestant criticism to continue hitting targets. The Jesuit order, founded by Ignatius Loyola in 1540, exemplified the Counter-Reformation approach of combining reform with aggressive Catholic assertion. The Jesuits emphasized education, establishing schools and universities that provided Catholics with intellectual formation that could compete with Protestant scholarship. They conducted foreign missions that expanded Catholicism globally, compensating for losses in Protestant territories with gains in Asia and the Americas. They served as confessors and advisors to Catholic rulers, strengthening links between Catholicism and political power. The Jesuits represented Reformed Catholicism that was intellectually rigorous, disciplined, and committed to institutional church in ways that addressed Protestant criticism of Catholic laxity while maintaining Catholic distinctiveness. The Index of Forbidden Books represented attempt to control intellectual environment and prevent Protestant ideas from spreading among Catholic populations. The Index prohibited Catholic reading of books that contained heretical ideas, Protestant theology, or criticism of church authority. The enforcement was uneven, but the attempt revealed churches' recognition that information control was crucial to maintaining Catholic loyalty in age of printing when Protestant literature could circulate widely. The Index couldn't prevent determined readers from accessing forbidden books, but it created legal and social risks for possession that reduced Protestant literature's spread. The information control demonstrated both churches' weakness in lacking other means to counter Protestant arguments and its remaining power to threaten those who defied prohibition. The emphasis on distinctive Catholic practices like the Latin Mass, clerical celibacy, veneration of saints, and monastic life created clear boundaries between Catholic and Protestant identity. Where Protestants rejected these practices, Catholics doubled down on them, making them markers of Catholic loyalty and tradition. The reinforcement of contested practices was partly theological conviction and partly strategic boundary maintenance.
If Catholics abandoned too many traditional practices in response to Protestant criticism, what would distinguish Catholicism from Protestantism? The retention of distinctive features preserved Catholic identity, but also preserved practices that many Catholics found burdensome or that seemed disconnected from spiritual experience. The tension between authentic reform and identity maintenance created complicated balances that varied by region and period.
The lifestyle differences between Catholic and Protestant territories became increasingly visible and significant. Catholic areas maintained elaborate feast day calendars, frequent religious processions, clerical celibacy, monastic presence, and sacramental system requiring regular priestly mediation. Protestant areas eliminated most feast days, simplified worship, allowed clerical marriage, dissolved monasteries, and emphasized direct relationship with God without priestly mediation. These differences created distinct daily rhythms and social experiences that shaped how Catholics and Protestants lived. The competition pushed both sides toward greater consistency and discipline because success in attracting and retaining members depended partly on delivering on promises of authentic Christian community. The scandal-driven Catholic reforms were partly internal response to corruption and partly competitive response to Protestant alternative. The reforms targeting clerical celibacy and convent enclosure had profound gender implications that shape women's lives in ways that men designing the reforms probably didn't fully consider. When priests were required to expel their concubines and housekeepers, women who had functioned as wives lost their social position, economic support, and, in many cases, their homes. These women had done nothing wrong beyond forming relationships that church law prohibited, but that local custom had tolerated. The reforms treated them as problems to be eliminated, rather than as people whose interests deserved consideration. Some received small pensions or settlements. Many received nothing. The collateral damage of clerical celibacy enforcement fell overwhelmingly on women who had no voice in the church governance that decided their fate. The increased convent enclosure restricted women's autonomy and mobility in ways that had no parallel for male religious. While monks faced increased discipline, they could still leave monastery grounds for legitimate business, for pastoral work, or for education. Nuns under strict enclosure could not leave under almost any circumstances, and their contact with the outside world was severely limited. The justification was protecting nuns from worldly contamination and preventing scandal. But the practical effect was treating religious women as requiring more stringent control than religious men. The gender asymmetry revealed assumptions about female weakness, susceptibility to temptation, and need for male protection that were embedded in the reforms despite their ostensible goals of improving religious life for both sexes. The marriage reforms that required public church weddings with clerical witnesses gave priests gatekeeping power over marriage formation that particularly affected women, because women's economic security and social status depended more on marriage than men's did. A priest who refused to witness a marriage for whatever reason could prevent a woman from marrying her chosen partner, potentially leaving her without legitimate means of support or forcing her to accept alternative partners the priest approved. The potential for abuse was significant, though actual abuse probably varied widely by individual priests' character. The structural power imbalance was real, regardless of how often it was exploited, because women needed priestly cooperation to achieve legitimate marriages, while priests could withhold that cooperation based on their judgments about couples' worthiness. The catechetical instruction requirements created expectations that mothers would reinforce religious education at home, adding unpaid domestic religious labor to women's existing responsibilities. The church assumed mothers were primary religious educators of young children, and that they would teach prayers, prepare children for confession and communion, and maintain religious practice in the household. This gendered division of religious labor made women responsible for families' spiritual health, while giving them no authority over church governance. The arrangement exploited female labor in service of church goals, while excluding women from decision-making about those goals. The structure created Catholic motherhood ideal, where women's primary value was reproducing and religiously forming the next generation of Catholics. The few women who gained some authority through reforms were those like Teresa of Avila, who founded or reformed religious orders, and whose spiritual authority was recognized despite institutional barriers to female leadership. These exceptional women demonstrated that female religious genius and administrative competence existed, but their exceptionality proved how rare it was for women to achieve recognition within institutional church. The reforms generally reinforced rather than challenged gender hierarchies, making the church more ordered but not less patriarchal. The gender implications weren't primary purpose of reforms, but they were significant consequences that shaped women's lives for centuries. The implementation of post-scandal reforms varied dramatically by region, depending on local political conditions, economic resources, and cultural traditions. Italian territories under direct papal control experienced most stringent enforcement because proximity to Rome made papal oversight effective, and because local authorities had strong incentives to demonstrate compliance. Northern European territories, especially those bordering Protestant areas, experienced uneven enforcement because Catholic authorities faced Protestant competition and couldn't afford to make Catholic practice too demanding lest they drive members to Protestant alternatives. Eastern European territories, under noble patronage, experienced selective enforcement because local nobles controlled church appointments and could resist reforms that interfered with their interests. Spain developed particularly rigorous Catholic practice under royal supervision that predated and then reinforced trance reforms. The Spanish Inquisition, The emphasis on limpieza de sangre, proven Christian ancestry, and the close alliance between Spanish crown and papacy created an environment where Catholic orthodoxy was enforced more strictly than elsewhere. The Spanish colonial territories inherited this rigorous approach, making Latin American Catholicism particularly elaborate in its devotional practices and particularly strict in its moral demands. The regional variation meant being Catholic in Spain or colonial Mexico involved much more intensive religious practice and oversight than being Catholic in some French or German territories where enforcement was laxer. France developed Gallican tradition, where French bishops asserted significant autonomy from Rome while remaining Catholic. The French Church accepted Trent's theological positions, but resisted some institutional reforms that would increase papal authority over French ecclesiastical appointments and finances. The compromise created distinctive French Catholicism that was more independent of Rome than Italian or Spanish versions. The regional variation demonstrated that the scandal-driven reforms strengthened papal authority unevenly, succeeding more in areas without strong local resistance and failing where local forces had incentives and resources to maintain independence. The Catholic universality was less universal than official doctrine suggested. The German territories that remained Catholic after the Reformation experienced the reforms most intensively because they were proving grounds where Catholicism had to demonstrate it could compete with Protestantism. The Catholic princes who maintained allegiance to Rome faced constant pressure from Protestant neighbors and from Protestant populations within their territories. The response was often to enforce Trent's reforms strictly, to demonstrate Catholic vitality, and to prevent further defections. The intensity of enforcement in these contested territories made Catholic practice more demanding there than in secure Catholic regions, creating an ironic situation where being Catholic was harder where Catholicism was weaker politically. The competitive pressure pushed Catholic rigor upward in ways that wouldn't have occurred in religiously homogeneous territories. The colonial territories presented unique challenges because indigenous populations were being converted to Catholicism that was simultaneously undergoing reform in Europe. The question of how strictly to apply European reform standards to new converts divided missionaries, with some arguing for gradual adaptation and others insisting on full, immediate compliance with reformed standards. The resolution generally favored adapted Catholicism, where indigenous practices were tolerated if they could be interpreted as compatible with Catholic doctrine, creating syncretic forms that looked different from European Catholicism while maintaining nominal orthodoxy. The colonial variation demonstrated the limits of institutional control over religious practice and the inevitability of local adaptation regardless of official universal standards. The physical churches and ecclesiastical buildings constructed or renovated after Trent embodied the Reformed principles in architectural form. The Catholic Baroque style that dominated post-Trent church architecture emphasized grandeur, emotional appeal, and clear focus on the altar and tabernacle in ways that Protestant churches didn't. The Catholic buildings were designed to impress, to inspire awe, to create sensory experiences that engaged worshipers emotionally and confirmed the majesty of God in church. The architectural statement was that Catholicism offered something Protestantism couldn't: the beautiful, the mysterious, the transcendent, made visible in stone and gold and light. The investment in elaborate churches was both religious devotion and competitive strategy in the contest for Christian allegiance. The rectories and bishops' palaces, built or renovated after reforms, reflected the emphasis on clerical discipline and oversight. The buildings were designed to facilitate appropriate priestly life rather than comfortable domestic arrangements. They included offices for parish administration, meeting rooms for church business, formal parlors for receiving parishioners, but relatively modest private quarters. The architecture communicated that priests were officials performing public function rather than private individuals with domestic lives. The design also facilitated supervision by making priestly activities visible and by eliminating private spaces where improper behavior could occur unobserved. The buildings embodied the institutional church's claim to authority over clerical life, extending into private domestic sphere. The seminary buildings, constructed to implement trans-educational reforms, were substantial institutional investments that shaped Catholic formation for generations. These purpose-built educational facilities included classrooms, libraries, chapels, and dormitories, organized to support intensive clerical formation. The seminaries physically separated candidates from secular society during years of training, creating enclosed environments where young men could be formed into priests according to post-Trent standards. The buildings represented commitment to educational infrastructure that Protestant denominations also developed, but that Catholicism had previously lacked. The seminary system's architectural legacy includes numerous substantial buildings across Catholic territories that now often serve other purposes, but that originally housed the clerical training that Trent mandated. The convents, renovated for strict enclosure, required architectural modifications, including higher walls, reduced gates, enclosed parlors with grills, and separate sleeping quarters. These modifications physically embodied the restrictions on female religious life that reforms imposed. The buildings made the restrictions visible and enforceable through their physical structure. Modern viewers can still see the architectural evidence of these restrictions in historical convents, where grills separate parlors, where walls surround grounds, and where the claustrophobia of enclosure is palpable even centuries later. The buildings are historical documents testifying to how the Church understood female religious life needed to be controlled and separated from the world. The missionary churches built in colonial territories reflected both European architectural models and local adaptations required by materials, climate, and indigenous labor. These buildings spread Catholic architectural vocabulary globally, making Baroque and later styles recognizable as Catholic regardless of geographic location. The missionary architecture demonstrated the Church's global ambitions and its success in creating cultural continuity across vast distances. The fact that many of these buildings remain as active churches centuries later testifies to the durability of the institutional expansion that accompanied Catholic reforms. The architecture that was partly response to European scandal became foundation for global Catholicism that transcended the European context of the original corruption. The scandal-driven reforms created Catholic culture that persisted into the 20th century, with distinctively shaped daily life, family organization, and social relationships. The emphasis on sacramental practice meant Catholics had regular interactions with clergy through confession, communion, marriages, baptisms, and funerals. The elaborate liturgical calendar structured time around numerous feast days requiring church attendance. The expectation of Catholic schooling created parallel educational institutions. The prohibition on birth control shaped family size and marital relations. The moral theology taught in confession shaped understanding of sin and virtue. Catholic culture became a total environment that influenced every aspect of life in ways that Protestants who had rejected sacramental system and elaborate tradition experienced differently. The persistence of anti-Protestant attitudes in Catholic territories reflected the competitive origins of Counter-Reformation Catholicism. Catholics were taught that Protestantism was heresy that endangered salvation, that Protestant services were invalid, that Protestant marriages weren't real marriages. This religious bigotry had civic consequences, including discrimination in employment, education, and politics against Protestant minorities in Catholic territories. The reciprocal Protestant bigotry against Catholics created religious divisions that poisoned European politics and fueled wars for centuries. The scandal-driven reforms that were meant to improve Catholic practice ended up entrenching religious divisions that made European religious unity impossible to restore. The unintended consequence was permanent Christian schism. The intellectual culture of post-Trent Catholicism emphasized tradition, authority, and continuity over innovation, questioning, or personal interpretation. This conservatism was partly theological conviction about revealed truth and partly strategic defensive posture against Protestant challenges. Catholic education stressed memorization of catechism, acceptance of church teaching, and obedience to clerical authority, rather than critical thinking or personal exploration of Scripture. The intellectual orientation shaped what kinds of questions Catholics asked and what kinds of answers they accepted.
The culture produced many brilliant Catholic scholars, but within framework that limited inquiry to questions that didn't threaten fundamental doctrines or challenge church authority. The defensive intellectual posture was both strength and weakness, providing stability while limiting adaptability.
The devotional practices that flourished in post-Trent Catholicism, including rosary, novenas, scapulars, medals, and pilgrimages, created rich experiential religious life that many Catholics found deeply meaningful. These practices offered tangible ways to express devotion, to seek intercession, and to feel connected to larger spiritual reality. The emotional satisfaction they provided was real and important to millions of believers. The practices also maintained boundaries between Catholic and Protestant identity because Protestants rejected most of these devotions as superstitious. The devotional culture was both genuine spirituality and tribal marker, distinguishing Catholic from Protestant in ways that made religious identity matter intensely to daily life.
The missionary expansion that accelerated after Trent spread not just Catholic doctrine, but also the Reformed Catholic culture to populations globally. The Catholic culture that converted populations encountered in Asia, Africa, and the Americas was the scandal-reformed, counter-Reformation Catholicism rather than medieval Catholic practice. The global Catholicism that emerged was therefore shaped by Europe's religious civil wars and Reformation controversies, even though most converted populations had no knowledge of or connection to those events. The colonized peoples inherited European Catholicism at a specific stage of its development, creating forms of Catholicism worldwide that reflect 16th century European reforms responding to scandals most contemporary Catholics know nothing about.
Contemporary Catholic Church scandals, including clerical abuse, financial corruption, and failures of institutional accountability, demonstrate that the reform mechanisms developed after medieval and Renaissance scandals didn't prevent future corruption. The patterns are familiar: individual wrongdoing, institutional cover-up, eventual exposure, public outrage, promises of reform, implementation of new procedures, and then new scandals revealing the reforms were insufficient. The cycle suggests that institutional corruption is a persistent problem that reforms can mitigate but not eliminate. The question is whether continuous reform efforts incrementally improve institutions over time, or whether they're futile exercises that create illusion of accountability without substantive change.
The financial settlements for abuse victims parallel the fines and redistributions that followed earlier scandals, with church assets being directed to compensate for institutional failures. The bankruptcies of dioceses unable to pay settlements demonstrate the financial consequences can be severe enough to threaten institutional survival. The comparison to earlier periods shows that financial accountability for corruption is a recurring mechanism for institutional discipline. The effectiveness depends on whether financial pressure creates genuine change or whether institutions simply reorganize, protect remaining assets, and continue problematic practices with more careful risk management. The history suggests skepticism is warranted, but that financial consequences do create some incentive for behavioral change.
The reform proposals following contemporary scandals echo earlier reforms in emphasis on transparency, accountability, and clearer procedures for handling complaints. The creation of review boards, mandatory reporting requirements, background checks, and training programs represent bureaucratic responses to systemic failures. These administrative reforms parallel Trent's emphasis on clerical education, episcopal residency, and structured accountability. The historical precedent suggests such reforms probably improve things marginally, but that determined wrongdoers can often evade even improved systems. The reforms make abuse harder and create more opportunities to detect and punish wrongdoers, but they can't prevent abuse entirely because they depend on human implementation subject to human failings. The continuing debates about structural changes like ending clerical celibacy or increase in lay governance echo earlier debates about reform depth. Some argue that only fundamental structural changes can prevent future corruption, while others argue that maintaining traditional structures is essential to Catholic identity. The tension between reform and tradition that animated Counter-Reformation continues in contemporary church debates. The history suggests that successful reforms usually involve compromises that change enough to address pressing problems while maintaining enough continuity to preserve institutional identity. The balance is difficult and contested because stakeholders disagree about how much change is necessary and how much tradition is negotiable. The observation that other institutions face similar patterns of scandal and reform suggests the Catholic story is a particular instance of universal challenges. Corporate governance, government accountability, educational institution oversight, and nonprofit transparency all involve similar dynamics, where institutional interests conflict with accountability demands, and where reforms create new bureaucracies that may or may not prevent future wrongdoing. The Catholic experience is instructive because it's documented over centuries, providing long view of how institutional reform works or fails over time. The lessons probably generalize. Reforms help but don't solve underlying problems. Financial consequences create real incentives for change. And persistence of wrongdoing despite reforms suggests that vigilance and accountability need to be continuous rather than one-time responses to specific scandals. Thank you for spending over 2 hours examining how papal scandals reshaped Catholic life across centuries. If you found value in understanding how elite corruption drives institutional reforms that affect ordinary people's daily lives, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to Candle History and share your thoughts below. Do you think institutions can prevent corruption through structural reforms? Or is scandal and reform an inevitable cycle? What modern parallels do you see? I genuinely read every comment. We began with popes behaving badly and the consequences that followed. Now, hours later, you understand that those consequences were far more extensive than punishing individual wrongdoers. The responses included financial penalties and redistributions that funded new institutional infrastructure, architectural changes that physically embodied reformed values, lifestyle restrictions that changed where and how clergy lived, household reorganizations that structured family religious practice differently, and cultural shifts that defined Catholic identity for centuries. The scandals themselves were often personal moral failures, but the responses were systematic institutional transformations affecting millions who had nothing to do with the original corruption. The sleeping arrangements that changed in response to scandals exemplify how institutional reforms penetrate daily life in unexpected ways. The requirement that priests live in supervised ecclesiastical housing rather than private homes, the enclosure reforms that restricted monastic contact with the world, the sleep schedules that interrupted nighttime rest for religious observance, all represent how moral failures by elites justified increased control over subordinates' most basic domestic activities. The reforms weren't just about preventing future scandal. They were about asserting institutional authority over aspects of life that had previously been relatively private. The transformation of scandal into surveillance created organizations where privacy was subordinate to compliance. The financial mechanisms that turned scandal into institutional transformation demonstrate how money mediates between moral failure and social consequences. The fines, confiscations, and redistributions provided resources for reforms while also punishing wrongdoers in material terms. The clerical taxation that funded seminaries and administrative improvements made clergy as class pay for their leaders' failures. The competitive pressure from Protestantism that forced Catholic financial reforms showed how scandal weakens institutions in competitive markets. The financial dimensions weren't peripheral to the religious and moral dimensions. They were how abstract principles got translated into concrete changes affecting real people's lives. The gender implications reveal how institutional reforms often impose differential costs on different populations based on power rather than on responsibility for original problems. Women who had functioned as priests' wives lost their positions when clerical celibacy enforcement intensified. Female religious faced stricter enclosure than male religious faced. Mothers were expected to provide domestic religious education unpaid. The reforms that were supposedly about preventing male clergy's sexual misconduct ended up controlling female behavior and extracting female labor more than controlling actual male behavior. The pattern demonstrates how institutional responses to scandals often displace costs onto less powerful populations rather than imposing costs primarily on wrongdoers. The regional variations in reform implementation show how centralized institutions functioned through local agents whose compliance varies with their interests and capacities. Trent issued universal rules, but actual Catholic practice differed dramatically by location, depending on enforcement resources, political conditions, and cultural resistance. The variation meant that being Catholic involved different daily demands depending on geography, making religious experience less uniform than theology suggested. The pattern of uneven implementation is universal challenge for large institutions, where central authority claims universality, but actual operation depends on local execution that central authority can't fully control. The persistence of scandal, despite reforms, demonstrates the limits of institutional self-correction. The Catholic Church has been reforming in response to scandals for over 1,000 years. Yet contemporary scandals show the reforms weren't sufficient to prevent corruption. The historical pattern suggests skepticism about whether any institution can create mechanisms that reliably prevent wrongdoing by individuals with power and motive to evade accountability. The reforms probably reduce scandal frequency and severity compared to counterfactual of no reform, but they can't eliminate scandal because determined wrongdoers will exploit whatever weaknesses exist in oversight systems. The question is whether incremental improvement over centuries is sufficient, or whether systemic problems require more fundamental restructuring than reforms typically accomplish. The reforms probably reduce scandal frequency and severity compared to counterfactual of no reform, but they can't eliminate scandal because determined wrongdoers will exploit whatever weaknesses exist in oversight systems. The question is whether incremental improvement over centuries is sufficient, or whether systemic problems require more fundamental restructuring than reforms typically accomplish. The Protestant Reformation's permanence demonstrates that some institutional crises can't be contained or reversed. The Catholic Church successfully implemented counter-Reformation reforms that stabilized its position and enabled continued global expansion, but it never recovered the European unity it had before the Reformation. The permanent split between Catholic and Protestant created competing Christian traditions that shaped global politics and culture for centuries. The scandal-driven crisis became irreversible transformation despite extensive reform efforts. The lesson is that institutional crises sometimes create new stable states rather than returning to prior equilibria, and that the window for preventing such transformations is often narrow and easily missed.
The modern parallels in every institution dealing with scandal suggests the Catholic experience reflects universal dynamics rather than unique religious circumstances. Corporate scandals trigger compliance reforms that increase bureaucracy. Government corruption exposes lead to oversight mechanisms that constrain future action. Educational institution failures produce administrative expansions that may or not prevent future failures. The pattern is consistent. Scandal creates demand for reform. Reform creates new administrative structures and costs. The reforms probably improve things somewhat, but don't eliminate problems entirely. And future scandals demonstrate the reform's limitations. The Catholic case provides centuries of evidence for how this cycle operates over time. What strikes me most forcefully is how scandal consequences ripple far beyond the individuals who caused them. The corrupt pope who hosts orgies in the Vatican triggers reforms that change where junior priests sleep a century later. The bishop who sells offices creates financial accountability systems that burden honest administrators. The institutional failure to address wrongdoing creates defensive bureaucracies that complicate normal operations. The costs of scandal are paid not primarily by wrongdoers, but by organizations and by innocent members caught in institutional transformations meant to prevent future wrongdoing. The distributed costs of scandal create collective action problems where everyone bears consequences for behaviors they didn't commit and couldn't prevent. The architectural legacy of scandal-driven reforms provides physical evidence of how moral failures shape material environments. The buildings constructed to embody Reformed values still stand centuries later, still shaping how people experience religious life, even when the scandals that triggered their construction are forgotten. The grills separating nuns from visitors embody assumptions about female religious life that originated in responses to particular scandals. The seminary buildings reflect educational reforms prompted by recognition that poorly trained clergy enabled corruption. The architectural permanence means that scandal consequences persist far beyond the scandals themselves, embedded in material culture that outlasts the social conditions that created it. The final lesson might be about the relationship between individual morality and institutional structure. The medieval and Renaissance church learned that relying on individual virtue was insufficient to prevent corruption, that institutional structures needed to constrain individual behavior and to create accountability mechanisms that didn't depend on personal integrity. The reforms represented institutional responses to the problem that some individuals in positions of authority will abuse power, regardless of religious teaching or moral formation. The structural solutions probably reduce abuse frequency, but they also create organizational rigidity and bureaucratic overhead that have their own costs. The balance between trusting individuals and constraining them structurally is a perpetual challenge for every organization. We began asking how papal scandals changed the way people slept and lived. Understanding they changed those things comprehensively and permanently by triggering institutional reforms that penetrated into domestic life, sleep schedules, household organization, family formation, and daily religious practice. The corrupt popes who thought only about their personal pleasures and political ambitions created crises that lasted generations and reshaped European Christianity fundamentally. The reforms that addressed those crises built institutional structures and cultural patterns that persisted long after the original wrongdoers were dead and mostly forgotten. The story is a cautionary tale about how elite corruption imposes costs on everyone else. But it's also evidence that institutions can learn from failures and that reforms can accomplish substantial improvements, even if they can't eliminate problems entirely. The Catholic Church today is more accountable, more disciplined, and probably less corrupt than during the pornocracy or Borgia papacy. Not because humans are better, but because centuries of scandal and reform built institutional mechanisms that make some behaviors harder and riskier than they used to be. The improvement is real, but incomplete. The vigilance remains necessary, and the next scandal is probably already developing somewhere in the institution, waiting to trigger the next round of reforms that will shape how future generations sleep and live.